Today, we're looking at a watch that is heavily inspired by vintage design and aesthetics. It takes a classic approach to the chronograph complication and looks like it could have come straight off the wrist of some lucky owner back in the 1940s. Or, I would be saying that, if this watch happened to do any of that at all. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're looking at a watch I unboxed in a previous video, the Pagani design PD1739. Now, what was that I said in the intro? It does do all that, doesn't it? Clearly it does. We can see it right there. Well, the answer to that is yes and no. Let's think back to what I said. Today, we're looking at a watch that is heavily inspired by vintage design and aesthetics. It may look like it, but I can assure you, this watch is not. This watch is inspired by or homaging a very new watch, the Furlan Mari Mr. Grey, which in turn is inspired heavily by vintage design and aesthetics. It's a watch that brought the new brand to the forefront of many watch enthusiasts' lists, and many of their watches have sold out before they are even produced. So, the Furlan Mari does all of those things I said in the intro, but not this Pagani. Now, that's not to say I don't like this watch or think it's a bad watch. It just wouldn't have ever been considered being made if not for the success of the Mr. Grey. In a way, it's doing exactly what Furlan Mari set out to do. It's making a very difficult watch or design affordable and easily obtainable. Grail watches for the masses. I find it somewhat ironic that Furlan Mari has more or less become part of the problem it set out to solve by becoming so popular. It's a victim of its own success, and now even their watches are hard to buy. But enough of that, let's look at the watch in front of us, and there is one thing I have to admit, it looks really good. I'm not usually into chronographs, and rather like to keep it simple on the dial, but I really like this one. There were 3 options on AliExpress when I was ordering mine. This grey one, a brown salmon dial, and a brushed blue one. I had a bit of a tough time choosing between this and the blue. I've really been wanting to get a good look at a brushed or linen dial, but my rationale for choosing this one was that I already have too many blue dialed watches. You haven't seen them all yet, but stay tuned, they're coming in future videos. When I bought mine, there was a sale on, and I paid just $86 Australian, or about $60 US. For that price, this watch packs a lot of value in. So, let's take a look at it. What better place to start than the dial that sucked in so many people to the Furlan, and now to the Pagani. There is a lot going on here, but at the same time, it's all very cohesive. There are 4 shades on the dial, a white outermost ring with a tachymeter that realistically, 99.9% of people who have a watch with one don't know how to use, myself included. But it does provide some visual detail. Just inside of that is a black minute track. On the minute track, each 5 minutes is marked with numbers, and 1/5 of a second are also marked. That black minute track is quite thin, and does not stand out as much as you'd think against the white tachymeter. It does contrast nicely, but it's not too jarring. The main part of the dial is a mid-grey colour, and on this part of the dial, we have applied polished hour markers. Around the dial, we've got quite a bit of variation. 6 and 12 feature Roman numerals, some hours get full batons, some get partial ones, and 3 and 9 have none at all due to those subdials. Speaking of subdials, you'll notice that none of them are moving. This watch has no running seconds at all, so it can be a little hard to tell if the watch is running at all. Instead, at the 3 o'clock, we have a fairly useless 24-hour hand that is linked to the main time and will always match that time. Opposite that at the 9 o'clock position is a subdial that tracks the minutes when the chronograph is running. Looking closer at those subdials themselves, they are actually textured with concentric circles, but it's a very subtle effect. In most instances you can't tell, and it looks like a flat grey colour. The hands on this watch are all fully polished, but I suppose if legibility is your number one concern, you wouldn't be buying a watch like this in the first place. The hour and minute hands are leaf-style hands, while the seconds hand is a simple needle hand. There is no lume to speak of on the watch at all, which is fine considering the style and what it's homaging. To be honest, if it had lume it would probably look a little out of place. Covering the dial is a surprisingly nice piece of domed sapphire crystal. I say surprisingly nice because the AR coating on this is fantastic. It cuts down reflections much more than many other watches I have, and looks like it's a clear coating rather than having that blue tint that so many other watches have. There genuinely are times when I look at it and I think there's no crystal there at all. It might be a strange thing to be a highlight of the watch, but it is. It is only slightly domed, which I also like. Sometimes subtle is better, and in this case I think it is. Moving back out far enough to get a look at the case, we see an appropriately sized 38.8mm case. In some of the listings on AliExpress, it was labelled as 40, but thankfully it's a bit smaller than that. For this style and aesthetic, it's the perfect size in my opinion. Lug to lug is a very manageable 45mm, while thickness come in at what sounds like a lot at 14mm. If that number puts you off, just wait a minute before stopping the video. Until I looked it up, I had no idea it was that thick. It does not feel like that at all when wearing it, and I think that is partially due to the doming of the crystal giving it a bit of extra height. The other reason I think it wears much better than you might think is those stepped cutouts on the bezel. Rather than having a solid bezel that is sloped quite steeply, the bezel climbs in steps to meet the crystal. This not only helps make the watch feel thinner than it actually is, it also breaks up the big polished surfaces that would have otherwise made this watch too shiny for my taste. On that note, I think they have achieved a very nice balance of brushed and polished surfaces on this particular watch. That stepped bezel alternates between polished and brushed surfaces, so it looks brushed from the top and polished from a side view. Also from that side view, we can see that there is a large brushed section running the length of the case, and breaking up the polish that is on top of those strongly curved lugs. The caseback on this watch is also quite nice. It echoes the bezel on the opposite side with its stepped levels and is radially brushed. On the back we can see something a little bit strange, and something that I haven't mentioned about the watch just yet. One of the specs engraved into the caseback is the 200 meter water resistance rating. Yes, I said 200 meters. Pagani even felt the need to put the word diver and a little fish on there. For a watch like this, that is a bit beyond overkill, but maybe it's there to satisfy all those people that cry out about not being able to take their vintage-styled chronograph with them when they go diving. So, how do they achieve this feat? Well, we can see that the caseback is quite solid and screws down onto the case, but if we turn the watch around to this side and have a look at the crowns, we get the rest of the story. There are more crowns than we're used to seeing on this channel. They're all quite nice though. The main crown is a mixture of polished and sandblasted with that brand logo. While the crown is not very long, it is fairly wide, which makes it easy to operate, and that's especially important because it screws down, which is how it gets that 200 meters of water resistance. It may seem strange at first, but a little later I'll get to why I actually don't mind that and think it's a surprisingly good idea. Those other two crowns are the pushers to operate the chronograph function of this watch. The top one at 2 o'clock starts and stops the chronograph hand, and the bottom pusher at 4 resets it. These crowns are quite long and have some nice engraved details on them. Unlike the main crown, they are not knurled because you don't turn these ones, you push them. And now we get to why I said I don't mind the crown screwing down. The movement inside this watch is of course a chronograph movement, and the particular movement it uses is the Seiko VK64 Mecha Quartz. What's a Mecha Quartz, I hear you asking? It's essentially a quartz movement with some mechanical elements in the chronograph function. Since it's a quartz movement, you're basically never really going to need to adjust the time, and so you won't need to operate the crown very often, which is why I think it's fine that it screws down. Where a regular quartz movement ticks once per second, the mechanical elements in this one mean we get a more mechanical-like sweep of the chronograph second hand. Let's push that top pusher and take a look. As it goes around, we can see it moving in a much smoother sweep, ticking 4 times per second. Pushing in that top pusher again, we can pause that hand, and if we use the bottom pusher, that hand snaps back up to the top. That is an instant snap as well, which is very satisfying. Some other cheaper quartz chronograph movements I've encountered have taken half a second or longer to return to the top of the dial, so this one snapping back is very satisfying. As I mentioned, that subdial at 9 counts up to 60 minutes, so you'll only be timing things up to 1 hour in length. One of the last things left to talk about with this watch is the strap. This watch is available on either a leather or mesh one. Since they were the same price when I ordered one, of course I chose the mesh, and I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised by it. It's very comfortable and, because of the clasp it uses, is infinitely adjustable to get the perfect fit. The clasp even has a security fold-over. Looking from behind, it comes with quick release spring bars too, and I've made use of those because I've actually been using this strap a lot with my Matcha Presage watch. I can't comment on the leather strap, that is the other option, but this both looks and feels good on the watch. And I guess now is as good a time as any to show you that as we check it out on my 7-inch wrist. The slightly smaller size I think works well on my wrist and will do on a wide range of wrist sizes, both smaller and larger. As I turn my wrist, you can see that there is not much distortion from the crystal, and also that it is staying very clear. When it's on my wrist, I really don't think it looks as tall as the 14mm suggests. The lugs really curve down sharply, and the whole case of the watch sits snug on my wrist. A chronograph watch is already pretty busy, so I think a smaller case size helps to tone it back a bit and keep it a little less in your face. Had I gone with the leather strap option, it would have come on a dark brown leather strap, and while I don't have one that looks exactly like the one in the listing, this vintage style leather strap with accent stitching looks fantastic on the watch. If the quality of the leather strap is anything like the quality of the mesh, then it too could be a perfectly good option for the watch. So far, I've only had good things to say about the watch, and to be honest, if you consider the price I paid especially, there isn't really anything worth complaining about. If I had to be nitpicky, I could say that the lack of running seconds makes it a little trickier to know if the watch is running. But at the same time, since it's a quartz movement, people may not want that because it gives away the fact that it's not actually a mechanical watch. Personally, I don't really care about that. And the other minor gripe is that the corner of the lugs here where it transitions from the side to the underside and brushed to polished is a little bit sharp. It's not rough and probably has more to do with the angles of the case itself creating a pointy edge, but it is something I came across when going over the watch with a fine-tooth comb, so I guess you should know about it. In daily operation and handling of the watch, however, it feels perfectly fine, and you won't notice it. So, that must make this a keeper in my collection, right? I've basically said myself that there is nothing to complain about. Well, probably not. I said it in the unboxing and earlier now too. I generally stick to more simple watches. 3 hands, a date, that just about does it for me. Maybe a day of the week too. I don't need anything else getting in the way. I will keep it for a little while, because, as I also said, I was surprised by how much I liked the watch when it arrived, and have enjoyed wearing it. Just don't hold your breath expecting it to see in my collection, a year or maybe even 6 months from now. What do you think about this watch? Is it just a cheap cash grab from Pagani, piggybacking off the success of the Furlan Mari? Well, of course it is. Most Pagani design watches are just that. Anyway, let me know what you think of this watch in the comments below. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.